is Tina Papic. I'm a Jungian analyst from Slovenia, Ljubljana, being also part of the steering committee of analysis and activism movement. Today's lecture title is Anima, Animus, Animix. Queer and trans challenges in analytical psychology. As we all know, 20th century brought us liberation from the bounds of our culture, which enabled us to reflect and think more critically and freely. The liberation created psychological space to think about certain important topics, cornerstones of our culture, which was not possible before. One of these fundamental topics for our society is certainly the question of gender. By no means do we exaggerate if I say that revolution happened in social sciences concerning these topics. But did analytical psychology follow it? For this reason, we decided to invite tonight George Taxidis. Let me shortly introduce him. George Taxidis, pronounced he, him, is a Jungian analyst, part of British Jungian Analytical Association and British Psychotherapy Foundation, working in private practice in East London. He is an associate lecturer at Goldsmiths, University of London, where he is involved in counselor training as well as psychosocial studies department. He was a co-founder of the queer social dreaming matrix, which playfully engages with dreams in the LGBTQIA+ community, as well as the Queer Analytic Circle and the International Queer Jungian Initiative, both of which are support and study groups for psychodynamic, psychoanalytic, and Jungian practitioners and trainees. His upcoming book on queering Jungian psychology will be published by Routledge. And now I would let George to take the stage.
Thank you, Tina. Welcome, everyone. It's really touching to see so many of you, who have kind of come here to listen to my ramblings on gender and sexuality. My favorite sort of topic, the topic that keeps me awake at night, or the topic that gets me up in the morning, actually. Before I start, I want to invite you to do something that we often do in the Queer Jungian initiative gatherings, which is, and this is of course optional, just like it is at the Queer Jungian gathering, is to just take a moment to go onto your tile on Zoom and look at the three. If you hover over your tile, you will see the three dots. And then if you click on the three dots, you will see the option to rename yourselves. I mean, don't worry if you can't find it, but if you can, and then see if you want to add your pronouns. So for me, my pronouns are he, him. For other people here, it's they, them. For some others, is she, her. And there's obviously a variety of other pronouns as well. And the idea really is that I don't want to make assumptions about your gender. And do that if you like, and notice how you feel as I'm inviting you to do that. Okay, I'm going to begin. I'm just going to begin with a couple of quotes. And I'm going to share my screen at the very beginning of the presentation, of my talk. And then I'm going to share my screen again about halfway through, a couple of long quotes. And then I'll share my screen again at the very end. But for the majority of the time that we'll have together, I will just be speaking to the camera, basically. So I'm just going to start with this quote here. Hopefully you'll see it. Bear with me a second. Sorry, just bear with me. Sorry. There we go. So this is Lila Watson, an artist, activist, and academic from Australia. A Gangulu artist, activist, and academic. And she says, if you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. There's a very similar moment, perhaps an extended version of what Watson says here, which is quite a famous quote. When a non-binary writer and performance artist, Alok Vaid Menon, is interviewed on the Man Enough podcast, and they, Alok, are asked by a heterosexual cisgender man how they're being asked how he can be a better ally. Alok responds with emotion, and they say, don't show up for me because you want to protect me or you want to help me. I don't need your help because I am divine. I come from people who were targeted by colonists because the gender binary was superimposed on Black people, indigenous people, and people of color by European colonists. And the reason that they targeted us was that they knew our power. I want us to rephrase the conversation to, instead of how can I help you, basically, to are you ready to heal? I don't think that most people are ready to heal. And that's why they're killing trans and gender variant people, because they've done this violence to themselves first. They've repressed their own femininity, their own gender nonconformity, their own ambivalence, their own creativity. When they see us have the audacity to live a life without compromise, instead of saying, thank you for teaching me another way to live, they try to disappear us because they did that to themselves first. So I would rephrase the question to, can you help me get free? Not, can you help me help you? And I'm really inviting you to, if you're on social media, to follow Alok, buy their products from their website, and generally support them as you can. I'm just going to stop sharing now this fabulous picture. Oops. Okay. So, and I'd like to invite us all to keep these quotes in mind, really, in terms of our own individual relationship to transness and queerness. It's right at the heart of what I'm attempting to do in relation to my own preoccupation with transness. And I'd like to argue that on a political, personal, spiritual, and therapeutic level, I absolutely wholeheartedly believe that I cannot separate trans liberation from my liberation and my individuation. I'm also arguing that trans liberation has the potential to revitalize. In fact, it probably already has revitalized our thinking about what it is that we do in analysis and therapy, as well as how we think about what I call the biopsychosocial spiritual field. Or other people may have called it that too, but that's, yeah. My main aim for tonight is to contribute to an ongoing discussion around the need in the field of psychotherapy in general and depth psychology, analytical psychology in particular, to take into account issues of oppression and power. My focus is on queerness and transness, but some of my arguments are drawn from other areas of difference, not because I want to collapse different experiences of oppression into each other, I don't, but because sometimes the mechanics of different kinds of prejudice are similar. So let me begin my thinking. So Jung, I think, was a pioneer in proposing the existence of the unconscious contrasexual element in everyone's psyche. In one way, this idea was not gender essentialist. Of course, in other ways it was, and could have even been anti-patriarchal at the time, particularly in relation to the dominant gender, to men, basically, and what this idea invited men to do, to sort of assimilate femininity, something that was seen with disgust and contempt. It was radical, because Jung suggested that for me as a man, it is imperative that I integrate this femininity. The publication of the Red Book further revealed just how central he thought this relationship with unconscious femininity was in the process of individuation. The Red Book and also subsequent texts imply some kind of understanding also that we live in a world that devalues and denigrates what is sort of designated as feminine. But what Jung didn't seem to understand or imagine is how socially constructed this categorization of psychic elements has been. So what he did, and if we're honest, what also bits of us still do, is this kind of more or less conscious fantasy that some psychic elements are essentially feminine, whilst some others are essentially masculine. In the Queer Jungian initiative, we had we were fortunate enough to hear a summary of the doctoral dissertation by James Perrin, a student in the Pacifica Graduate Institute. And James goes as far as to suggest that for a variety of reasons, all of us somehow know the gender of everything. And that includes objects as well as activities, as well as, everything has been assigned a gender. And I would agree with James on this. So we have a situation, for example, where recycling, I don't know whether people have heard of this, was an article research that came up sort of in relatively recent months. So recycling is a feminine activity, apparently. Because of, and we can imagine why, because caring is supposedly not, not a masculine sort of trait, in this kind of very rigid view of things. I know that there have been attempts to look at this in different ways, and for example, talk about logos and eros rather than masculinity and femininity. I don't see a huge problem in all of this, but I think the trouble is that even this is actually a collection of different traits rather than one thing, if you like. There's huge complexity, I'm arguing, within what logos and eros stand for. Just like there's huge complexity within what we traditionally call masculinity and femininity. And within this complexity, I would agree that there are a lot of polarities, basically. The problem for me in Jung is not so much the binaries in themselves, because I think that what he does with binaries is interesting and also in some ways postmodern and even queer, perhaps. So the problem is not on these kind of binaries, in my view, at least. So, for example, there can be a continuum, let's say, between somebody who wears colorful clothing and somebody like me who is a bit more boring than that. And there can be another continuum that we can think about, say somebody who's very insecure about whether their partner loves them or not, and somebody who isn't. And somehow society has categorized, colorful clothing and being insecure about being loved with femininity, and the kind of boring clothing I wear and being of avoidant sort of attachment style with masculinity. And this is arbitrary. I would like to sort of argue, and Jung tends to implicitly respond to that, to this kind of critique, by saying, well, okay, there is an archetypal reason behind these societal norms, and there's perhaps even wisdom in them. I don't know whether I haven't found anywhere where he says this very explicitly, but I think it's fairly almost always implied when he talks about these stuff. And that's where I think Jung becomes a lot less useful in terms of queer individuation. He wasn't just a man of his time, in other words, he was very much a politically conservative man of his time, at least in a considerable number of issues. Not in every issue, but at least, but in many. And this is also evident, just to sort of, be very clear, in the fact that Jung says that although there's an unconscious feminine in men, and an unconscious masculine in women, a man, even that a man can live in the feminine part of himself, a woman in the masculine part, but he says a man should live as a man and a woman as a woman. And that's Collected Works 10, in case anybody wants to search for it. And he's quoted in Hopke in Jung, Jungians and Homosexuality. There's really no reason to believe this, or rather to force people to enforce this on people. other than this obsession with this binary view of gender that's basically the hallmark of Western European thinking. Some might argue, and Jung implies this, a lot in many occasions, that the most important opposition in the universe is gender difference. But now we know that this is just a particular view. This is just one way of looking at things. There's the academic called Oyeronke Oyewumi, who is the author of The Invention of Women. And she explains that the category woman did not exist in Yoruba land, in what is today called Nigeria, prior to Western colonization. The predominant marker of social organization was age, not gender. And by the way, this book, I discovered it through Alok Vaid Menon, who I mentioned earlier, who creates these really helpful summaries of various kind of interesting books on the intersection between gender binary, race, and colonization. This idea led me to think about gender as a diagnosis. This is something that I've shared with friends in the Queer Jungian initiative. And what I mean by this is that gender is as useful and as useless as a psychiatric diagnosis. So when a patient comes and says, I have a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder, I would have a broad sense, the key word being broad here, of what they mean. But this diagnosis is simply a collection of characteristics. The diagnosis tells me something about this person, but it's useless if I begin to have specific expectations about their behavior, or even worse, if they begin to attach themselves rigidly to this list of characteristics. I think that what Jung meant by the contrasexual might have some use, with some modification. I don't think I'm the first one to suggest this, that perhaps some of what he included in the contrasexual could just be seen as part of the personal shadow, actually. Why does it need to be this separate sort of entity, and more specifically an archetypal entity that is about unconscious elements to do with gender? What is this obsession with gender, in other words? I'm also aware that I'm not the first one to begin to think about something more gender neutral in relation to the concepts of anima and animus. James Perrin, they came to our gathering at the queer unions, and they have come up with this wonderful idea of animum, so the Latin ending, if you like. And I've heard somebody shared about a student who came up with an idea of Animx, which is very similar to what I've come up with Animx. And I'm okay to say that something about all of this, has some archetypal energy, even that there's something present here that has the quality of numinosity of what Jung called the symbol-making process, But I'm actually reluctant to suggest that this is an archetype, Animx, that is. Perhaps that's because what I mean by Animx can only be an archetypal image rather than an archetype. And perhaps also because I'm generally quite reluctant to see anything too specific as an archetype. It makes more sense to me to accept the Jung who has a theory about archetypes as, in seeing them as abstract as possible, basically, and as unknowable as possible. So it can only be an image, an archetypal image rather than an archetype, because it's so, what I mean by Animx is so tied up with society, with societal norms, etc. And Animx really, in this sense, is that little bit of my gender and sexuality that is unrealized because it doesn't fit with what the current rules about gender and sexuality say. That's what I mean about when I talk about Animx, basically. So he puts right at the center this idea of what is accepted and what isn't accepted, really, what is according to the norms and what isn't. And just to clarify that, I know that sometimes the charge, the accusation towards queer and the concept of queer and queer theory is that, there's privileging of the non-normative, basically. But I want to acknowledge also that to some extent, queer theory has acknowledged the joys of fitting in. Even Judith Butler, the patron saint of queer theory, in their book Undoing Gender, talks about norms that actually allow people to breathe. So norms are not just, I'm not just saying that norms are oppressive, but to a large extent they are. So that in that sense, we could even go as far as sort of saying that maybe queer, or what I propose as kind of the symbol X in Animx, doesn't have to be about sort of challenging norms necessarily, but just paying attention to this binary between assimilation, fitting in on the one hand, and rejection of norms on the other. Or X could be, or Animx could be one pole of this archetype, because archetypes tend to be this bipolar sort of notion. I just want to also acknowledge that, you know, using a letter as a symbol to stand for something important in the field of analytic theory is also not new. Bion, as people might know, famously use a range of letters, like the alpha function and the ultimate O and all of that, you know. And Lacan also used mathematical functions, apparently towards, I'm not particularly knowledgeable about Lacan, but towards the end of his career, I believe he used sort of mathematical sort of symbols. And interestingly, Darian Leader, who is a Lacanian analyst, implies that it's male analysts in particular who have a tendency to enjoy this way of representing ideas with mathematical symbols. I thought that was sort of interesting. Maybe I am being gender conforming by using the kind of single letter to symbolize something important. One of the sources for this idea about centering the symbol X came from a paper by Chakira M. Haddock Lasala, a Latinx person who attempted to train as a psychoanalytic therapist in the US, I believe in New York. She raised various issues around prejudice in her training, and as far as I can tell, she was treated quite appallingly by her training. And then she wrote a paper about it, about her experiences of training, in the journal Studies in Gender and Sexuality. The title was Xing Psychoanalysis, so X, ing, making X into a verb, in other words. Rejecting it in some kind of way, really, having been rejected herself. So already X is used here in two different ways that I find interesting, and they seem central in what I'm trying to convey. So X is an alternative ending to a highly gendered language. For those who don't know, for example, in Spanish, of course, and particularly, if you belong to what is called now the Latinx community, you are either a Latino or a Latina, depending on your gender. And there's a huge kind of tendency nowadays, not just in the queer community, but in the broader sort of Latinx community, to refer to it as Latinx and not as Latino community or Latina community. And I feel a strong sense of solidarity with Spanish-speaking siblings of mine, because Greek, which is my first language, is also an oppressively gendered language. One anxiety-provoking example from my childhood was, telling my parents that I was going to spend some time with my friends, and it was impossible to say that without without actively lying about the gender of the friends that I was going to spend time with. In my case, it was spending time with female friends, amigas in Spanish, files in Greek, and therefore clearly not performing masculinity adequately, because I was a boy and I needed to spend time with boys, and make friends with boys. What was I doing making friends with girls, really? Another meaning of X, obviously, is to do with some kind of rejection, some kind of putting an X onto something, something to do with entering a field and perhaps changing it. maybe radicalizing it or even queering it in the way that I use it. But X has, I think, so many other sort of interesting connotations. You know, it's used as a sign that denotes a kind of sexuality that is located at the margins of what is socially acceptable. It denotes pornography, for example. You know, so the more X's, the harder the pornography, apparently. Or there's X-rated films, you know, films that, you know, are clearly out of bounds for the young, you know. Or X as the unknown in a mathematical function. So I think it has, you know, it has this kind of potential to stand for something to do with the unconscious. Now, I know that many people in the field, perhaps even those who are politically minded or who consider themselves to be progressive, roll their eyes with all of this, with what I'm presenting, really, or with in response to this community, really, and these new considerations with language. The work of recognizing our own and our culture's prejudices is painful. You do it once, and you just hope you never have to do it again. It's sorted now, no need for further acknowledgement. Personally, I don't know whether I will end up feeling like this in 20 years' time. I hope not, but I think it would be arrogant to rule it out. The unconscious works in mysterious ways. I want to offer a small example of what I mean by all of this, one that isn't explicitly about queerness, but it's about another area, about Jewishness and anti-Semitism. I'm just quite aware that it was also the Holocaust Memorial Day yesterday. And the example is from Anthony Stevens, a Jungian from the UK, who actually, incidentally, I found out lives in Greece now. So we've swapped places, Anthony and I. So in his little book, Jung, a very short introduction, in chapter 8, he discusses Jung's anti-Semitism, or as he puts it, Jung's alleged anti-Semitism. When I first read it, which was many years ago, I was astonished by two passages which I would like to share with you. And the two passages were just 2 pages apart, page 146 and 148. And I'll quote them at length here. I'm just going to share my screen because relatively long quotes. I hope you can see okay. Bear with me. So this is the first passage, page 146. He says, the culture in which Jung grew up was inherently anti-Semitic. By our contemporary standards, it was a racist society. Even the best educated Europeans believed that blacks were inferior and that Jews were a problem. Both propositions were accepted by the majority as self-evidence, hard though it is to believe for people born after 1945. That's my emphasis, by the way. That fateful year when a tidal wave of horror engulfed the European spirit and transformed our understanding of what it can mean to belong to a minority group. There is a subtle, I'm just going to make a quick comment before reading the second paragraph. There is a subtle, but I think very powerful claim here. We, in inverted commas, are now in a much better place, according to Stevens. In 1994, when he was writing this, we are in a much better place to understand better what it can mean to belong to a minority group. We've had a bloody world war, he says, which was motivated, at least in part, by hatred towards minorities. Surely we now know more about what it means to be a minority, and crucially, how we might be able to avoid repeating history. Now, I believe that this is contradicted by the following passage on page 148. I'll be curious to hear what people make of this and whether they think I've got a point here or not, really. So 2 pages later, he says, Freud's biographer, Ernest Jones, was aware of how quick Freud and his Viennese circle were to diagnose anti-Semitism in their opponents. he says he became aware, somewhat to his astonishment, that's Ernest Jones, of how extraordinarily suspicious Jews could be of the faintest sign of anti-Semitism, and of how many remarks or actions could be interpreted in that sense. Freud was no exception. He had the common Jewish sensitiveness to the slightest hint of anti-Semitism, and he made very few friends who were not Jews. I mean, I wonder if people can see the similarities with the topic I'm talking about, but I'm just going to stop sharing and continue speaking. So Stevens also uncritically quotes Jung when he talks about the Jewish and the Aryan psyche. And basically Jung protests that he's not doing anything sinister, and he goes on to say, why this ridiculous touchiness when anybody dares to say anything about the psychological differences between Jews and Christians? Let me just read it again. Jung says here, that's again Collected Works 10, why this ridiculous touchiness when anybody dares to say anything about the psychological differences between Jews and Christians? Okay. I don't know whether people are familiar with the word snowflake. It's a very recent kind of term, relatively recent term, which is thrown usually at left-wing people and members of minorities when they are upset about oppression and prejudice and all of that. And in a way, what Jung is doing is that he's accusing his critics of being snowflakes, really, and particularly Jewish people in this case, maybe others, and maybe Jewish people and their allies, actually. Now, but this is the thing, isn't this precisely what we haven't learned from the ongoing battles to do with minority groups? That what I might see as offensive to you feels like ridiculous touchiness. And what we see in the two quotes is that when the aim is to convey that Jung might have made some anti-Semitic comments, anti-Semitic sounding statements, but this was done in the context of a heavily anti-Semitic society. We need to understand, in this case, Stevens is being very contextual, very interested in the context. But when he, and as it happens, Ernest Jones as well, when they are evaluating whether Freud and his circle were over the top, whether they were unreasonable, frankly, a bit paranoid, and of course, as a result, quite domineering, the context, the society, which was highly hostile towards Jewish people, and still is to some extent, this context is forgotten. It's not used to understand, why Freud was so touchy. In this sort of area, which I think is very much related to this, to the topic of transness and queerness, I was very interested in Sarah Schulman's work, Conflict is Not Abuse. Some of you probably are aware. I think she's making some very interesting points, particularly about this tendency to behave in ways that are more appropriate really to relationships that are only based on social media, where many people often excommunicate somebody from their community, etc., etc. But what I found lacking in Schulman's work was that I don't think she really questioned this notion of who decides whether it's conflict or abuse, which goes right to the heart of some of the political discourse and debate at the moment, really, where just because my conscious intentions were benevolent, I should stop listening to what others feel in response to my words and my actions. Another useful thought in this area comes from James Baldwin, a line from the posthumously published I Am Not Your Negro, in which, talking to white people, he says, "You give me a terrifying advantage. You never had to look at me. I had to look at you. I know more about you than you know about me," and that you know about yourself, actually. What does he mean? I think he means something that the Black Lives Matter movement has been trying to tell us white folk for some time, namely that we, white people, might not exactly be experts on what counts as racism. Similarly, those without direct experience of transness and transphobia might not have an inalienable right to tell trans or queer people that something is not prejudiced or transphobic. It's a very common, where people tell trans people that this is not transphobia, or complain that too many things are designated as transphobia. This is relevant today for those who roll their eyes when they're asked to think about the impact of things like pronouns, for example. The impact that they have on all of us, really. Or when somebody is inviting them to add more letters to the LGBTQIA+ sort of acronym, or to consider more oppressed groups, groups that might in the past have supposedly been included under the heading gay. Really, you know, that was the only word, and I think many people were excluded from that. The image that I find helpful, which I drew from a queer social dreaming matrix session, is that although all of this can feel like extra work, like a nuisance, it can seem confusing, people say that it's confusing, you know, and all of that, actually, you could see it slightly differently. You could see it as, you know, yes, that there might be discomfort and there might be surprise, but it's quite similar, perhaps, to this feeling that's very common in dreams, where somebody is in a dream and discovers new rooms into their home. Suddenly their house has more rooms, basically. So what is possible here is an actual expansion, a sign of societal maturation, in the sense of integrating more aspects that have up to now been unconscious. What I want to emphasize also here is that, having said all of this, it's very important to sort of emphasize that gender and sexual diversity are not new trends. Gender variance has always been around. They have always existed. So this idea that they are new trends, you know, is frankly rubbish. And I'm also trying to say something about homosexuality here. Something that one might argue, you know, that there has been some integration in relation to homosexuality. In fact, in many Western countries, homosexuality, and more specifically white, vanilla, as in not kinky, not BDSM, monogamous homosexuality, or at least homosexuality that looks this way, is not only more widely accepted, but acceptance of it is used as a measuring stick for progress and enlightenment. The more seemingly accepting an individual, an organization, or a country is towards this kind of homosexuality, the more civilized, in inverted commas, it is. And this is called Homo-nationalism, coined by Jasbir Puar. Another theorist, Raoul Rao, has also coined another term, which is Homo-capitalism. And Homo-capitalism is essentially what this cultural homo-nationalism couldn't achieve, Homo-capitalism does by offering neoliberal incentives to global South countries to adopt equal right policies at state level. Just to clarify what I mean here, homo-nationalism is when we sort of say that we are progressive in the West and those in the global South are sort of regressive, they're backward, they're uneducated, all of these things. Often the result of this is that homophobes in these countries sort of become anti-imperialists, right? And usually it's not particularly effective. But when you sort of, well, essentially blackmail other countries with various economic sort of measures, then you know, various countries acquiesce. I mean, I'm quite familiar with this process because I come from a country that, you know, suffered from a lot of homophobia, especially when I was growing up. And a lot of hope came from the European Union and Western Europe, supposedly. You know, that was supposedly, you know, if you were progressive, if you were gay, that was what you were hoping for. But of course, this is also problematic, you know, in terms of the kind of policies that come with attachment to the European Union. I'm just to clarify, in the UK, I would have supported remaining in the EU. It's a very, very different sort of situation. But going back to my argument here, so this idea of homo-capitalism and homo-nationalism, it has gone so far, you know, that one can see research, for example, a research paper from researchers from the University of Queensland in Brisbane, Australia, which links homophobia, specifically prejudice towards same-sex couples, with low IQ. And the article that reported on this piece of research on the Pink News website was titled, "Homophobes are more likely to be stupid, according to science." Now I'll come back to the issue of stupidity. I'm doing a little bit of stupidity in a minute. But for the time being, I just want to argue that this title is not particularly countercultural, at least not within a white middle-class environment in which Jungian analysis and psychoanalysis operate. This argument that prejudice is just stupid and therefore other is very much part of our social context. Imagine, however, if the article was to link transphobia with stupidity. I think we would have a lot of protest from a lot of supposedly educated people. In the UK, the psychoanalytic establishment has been affected by this logic, I think, where psychoanalysis could resist the equivalent of homo-nationalism. In other words, it could resist a cultural shift where homophobia was beginning to be considered sort of problematic, you know. And it could resist this, just like countries could resist homo-nationalism in the name of anti-imperialism. I think psychoanalysis could also sort of claim in the UK that it was being countercultural and going against the grain and all the rest of it. But when legislation came into force and a kind of homo-capitalism took place, you know, whereby, you know, it would, you know, various institutions, their funding was threatened, and therefore in 2010 the decision was made to stop officially discriminating towards gay trainees and gay applicants to train as psychoanalysts and psychoanalytic therapists. Now, some of the energy of my argument and some of my rage, you know, could be attributed to the fact that a large proportion of my Jungian milieu is here in the UK context, where there is such a significant proportion of Jungians who probably feel a bit more comfortable, perhaps more satisfied, perhaps happier with the designation psychoanalyst and psychoanalytic psychotherapist. I think this is relevant to queer considerations in a number of ways. Not just that the developmental psychoanalytic tradition has had a more explicit history of excluding people like me until 2010, just 12 years ago, 11 years ago. Although, you know, that is relevant, that is significant, that the developmental psychoanalysis has been more explicitly homophobic. But it's also the case, I believe, that some developmental Jungians, despite some very impressive work that has been done, that shows that post-Freudians aren't that far from what Jung said, or that the Jungian field has a lot to gain from explorations into early infancy. But I think that at least part of the motivation for engaging with these areas and engaging with the psychoanalytic sort of establishment here, perhaps an unconscious motivation, if I'm allowed to assume that, was that they wanted to be included in the mainstream psychoanalytic establishment. In other words, this desire to be included, I'm arguing, is very much related to queerness, you know, yes, so they're not. It's the opposite of putting. It's the opposite of X, really, of what I'm suggesting as X, really. And I believe that this is important because, you know, I think we need to look beyond this idea of, you know, and I know I'm not the first one to say this, but, you know, this keeps coming up as an argument, this idea that they were men of their time, you know, these people, Freud, Jung, you know, Klein, even, you know, von Franz, you know. But when it comes to all of these people and their gender essentialism and occasional homophobia, you know, what strikes me is that the issue is not so much, you know, there isn't any dispute, in my view, about the fact that these people were products of their time. What I think interests me more, and I'm inviting you to be interested more in, is to take a closer look into the ways in which these people, reflected their times. And I'm not suggesting this as just a historical inquiry. They're fascinating, these historical inquiries, but that's not my main aim. My aim is to have this kind of inquiry that will hopefully help us today to be more cautious and more humble about how we arrive at conclusions about our epistemology, in other words. So Jung, in my view, was a genius in many ways, but if he can sometimes be an idiot, then maybe I can be an idiot as well. I should be open to that possibility as well. And here's my bit about stupidity. So stupidity might seem like an odd theme to grapple with when the topic is gender, sexual, and relationship diversity, but bear with me. I think stupidity, it can be another word for something that is unconscious, or an element of the psyche that has been pushed down. So I agree with Jung and with many Jungians that if I consciously want to be one thing, for example, enlightened, progressive, clued up to date on these issues of diversity, there is another side of things, and somewhere in me there is a part that is quite stupid when it comes to these issues. Personally, even if I wanted to shelter myself from any signs of that, I simply wouldn't be teaching at university, and especially not such a left-wing university as Goldsmiths, full of very, very clued up, very progressive and very open-minded students. Students who let me know all the time when I have messed up, when despite my professed intentions to be inclusive, I have acted in ways that reinforce other people's oppression. I'd even go further and say that even if we are aware of the possibility of being idiots, there's no guarantee that we won't be idiots. Jung is an excellent example of that, a brilliant example of that, or maybe a stupid example of that. The word stupid or stupidity occurs 42 times in the Red Book. Almost half of these are in the Magician chapter. The beginning of that chapter could be seen as a dialogue with Philemon, or the magician. I think he's still called the magician at that point. Could be seen, this dialogue as a meditation on what is psychotherapy or what is teaching, or ostensibly is about what is magic, but I think it's also all of these other things. The wise magician essentially encourages Jung to realize the value of, among other things, stupidity. In his subsequent reflections, Jung says that he laughed at the stupidity of the stupid, but now he has to learn to admire the stupidity of the clever. Let me just say that once again, because I love it. Jung says, I used to laugh at the stupidity of the stupid, but now I have learned to admire the stupidity of the clever. Page 45 in the Reader's Edition, if you want to go and have a look. Now, obviously, one can take this idea and use it in all sorts of ways. One can say that I'm trying to be clever when I point out prejudices in classical texts, or even more recent texts, or when I suggest that there might be transphobic or queerphobic, for example, and that I need to be aware of my own stupidity, or my own prejudice. And this makes sense. It's a valid argument, except for when it's used to shut someone up, of course. And I think it is used sometimes to shut people up. I would argue, however, that there's a colossal attempt within our field to be very clever when some clinicians and thinkers try to explain away mysterious things such as gender and sexuality. It might seem that some people have not learned lessons from the past, or perhaps that lessons need to be clarified again and again and again. And this has to touch on long-standing questions about etiology, about why, the why of gender and sexuality. About 3 years ago, I was at one of a number of analytic conferences and events held in London at the time on gender and transgender. There were loads of them. Suddenly, all psychotherapy organizations were organizing conferences and talks about transgender. One of the comments that made an impression on me was by an analyst who very innocently said, she was a psychoanalytic therapist, I think, and she very innocently said, of course, we are analysts, so we have to look at the reasons behind things to understand the why, right? This analyst really helped me crystallize something in my mind, that this is part of the epistemological difficulty in the broader field of psychotherapy. And here's where some of Jung's ideas can be incredibly useful, because although he wasn't against looking at etiology and causality, he fought against this temptation to just look at etiology and causality and just stop there. He's also his prospective view of the psyche, where he looked at psychopathology and the purpose of symptoms, you know, or behavior, you know. That can also, I think it's refreshing, obviously, you know, but that can also become a bit of a tyranny. I think a more spiritual approach to the psyche, a recognition that there are areas that we just don't know about, is potentially the most useful approach. I think a queer Jungian approach doesn't stop at adopting a biopsychosocial view of gender, which now is quite widely accepted within the broader field, you know, within even, you know, hard sciences, you know. So this idea of the biopsychosocial, but a queer Jungian approach should add the spiritual too. So I'm sorry, you know, we have long acronyms and now I'm adding a really, really long word. Let's begin to use this word, biopsychosocial-spiritual. You know, why stop? You know, well, we can add more. And I think it's possible that some trans authors have sort of pointed at this. There is this kind of quote by Kate Bornstein, a trans actor in America. And she says, and this is often quoted by Meg John Barker, a non-binary psychologist here in the UK. So Meg John Barker often quotes Kate Bornstein, who says, gender is a big ball of wibbly wobbly, gender blendery stuff. And slightly more seriously, Julia Serrano, the author of Whipping Girl, says that when she discovered her transness, she just saw it as this inexplicable thing. I think this points us to something really important, where a Jungian epistemology, I think, is really useful. Jung himself, on many occasions, was incredibly specific and prescriptive about things, about the unconscious. You know, you meet the shadow first. The anima is the bridge to deeper layers of the unconscious. It's the first half of life where it's a duty to sort of establish yourself, and the second half of life, you know, is where one develops spiritually. And more pertinently for the theme of today, you know, a man has to live as a man and a woman has to live as a woman. You know, despite this recognition of unconscious femininity and unconscious masculinity. We have to take all of this with a generous pinch of salt. Jung, I think, at his best is when he questions these certainties and is in awe of the unconscious. For me, this is exemplified quite beautifully in Jung's dialogue with the magician in the Red Book. Magic or psychotherapy or supervision or teaching is not about understanding, Philemon says. We have to give up understanding to some extent, right? And yet I think we see this kind of completely, I think, unjustified. I'm almost at the end of my ramblings. I think we see this certain kind of completely unjustified arrogance from many quarters. The one I'm most familiar with, by virtue of proximity here in London, is the one that attempts to understand trans subjectivity through the idea of trauma, specifically. This would be laughable if it wasn't so damaging, actually. Laughable because in some cases, those same people with these ideas and this kind of clinical practice should really know better. Some of them, only a few years ago, would apply the same etiological claims on homosexuality. Why have they stopped talking about homosexuality? These are very specific people I have in mind, by the way. I don't know whether you can tell that. So why have they stopped talking about homosexuality? Perhaps because they're now adapting to societal norms that say, you know, don't ask these questions about homosexuality. But I definitely don't think that they are adapting because they genuinely can see how utterly pointless and damaging this line of inquiry was. They're only doing it, you know, because they're just doing what they know how to do best, which is to conform, really. And as queer people, we know that this has limited effectiveness, this kind of trying to conform. Anyway, questions of etiology are not going away, and our patients are also asking these questions. You know, am I like this or am I like that because of early experiences or social influence, you know, or biology or something more numinous? I'm gonna talk a bit again about Alok Vaid Menon, who in another sort of interview, they talk about you know, the soul searching that they went through. They're kind of wondering whether they would need to medically transition, or whether they were non-binary, or what this meant for them and all of that. And, you know, after all of this soul searching, they arrive at this very simple answer. They say, I decided to do what gives me joy. Of course, we know that things are very complicated, but at some point, we have to accept that some people have to do what gives them joy. And we have to trust them that they know, I think. And who asked these questions of etiology, I think, and with what aim, matters a great deal. This is my final little point before I show you another quote. In an interview with Novara Media, which is a small left-wing news outlet here in the UK, transgender activist and author Julia Serrano was asked with some urgency by Michael Walker, the interviewer, who is a gay man, what she thinks, Julia Serrano, as a scientist, she's a biologist, about this question. Michael said that, unlike many left-wingers, he said, he finds that it is acceptable to say that gay people, trans people, were born this way. And born this way, by the way, apart from an expression, for those of you who don't know, I mean, I'm not particularly clued up about pop music, but it's a very famous song by Lady Gaga. And Julia, you know, she again talks, just like she talks about it in her book, she talks about her transness as something inexplicable, and that experiences in the external world interact with the brain, and that essentially it's impossible to separate the biological with the social, with the psychological, with the early history, and, you know, with all of that. And, you know, to my surprise, I have to say, she then sort of concludes that she would be born trans no matter what society she was born in. And in my view, this sounds like something that's I don't think Julia is particularly spiritual. I might be wrong, but it sounds like a very, you know, transpersonal kind of comment to make. And I think this fantasy of being able to separate these things, separate the biological from the psychological from the social, you know, all of this is a very kind of scientific and particularly sort of early Enlightenment kind of thinking that Jung was particularly allergic to, and therefore Jung can be quite useful, I think, in this area. Okay, I'm almost at the point of shutting up. I'm just going to share the final quote I want to share with you. This is Paul Preciado. I really, really wholeheartedly recommend his this little book, Can the Monster Speak, which is basically his talk. This is a trans man in front of 3,500, I think, Lacanian, predominantly psychoanalysts in France. So here's what Paul says. He says, when a man takes responsibility for a tiny share of the housework, people talk about it and herald it as progress in the equality of the sexes and women's liberation. These acts of liberation make me laugh so hard that my chest quivers like a drum skin danced on by a centipede. Very poetic. Liberation, whether gender or sexual, cannot, under any circumstances, be a more equitable redistribution of violence, nor a more pop acceptance of oppression. Liberty is a tunnel that must be dug by hand. Freedom is a way out. Liberty, like the new name by which you now call me, or the vaguely hirsute face you see before you, is something that is carefully fabricated and exercised. I find this quote very, very, very inspiring, and it also reminds me of the lyrics from an old song very British song called "Sing If You're Glad to Be Gay," and the lyrics that particularly brings to my mind is the bit where the singer says, "The buggers are legal now. What more are they after?" And the answer is really quite a lot. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, George, for this wonderful talk. Now I would invite others to join, comment, question. Maybe we would try to use the reaction button and the hand raising. Okay, Paul, I see. I would invite you.
Sorry, you know me, I'm always, I always have a question in, maybe this is a core of things with analysis and activism, because of course activism tends to be ideological, where analysis is more taking apart. But you know, there's that curious, a curious thing about the Stevens quotes. They may not be quite as stupid as they sound. You know, he's not looking at it carefully. He's not comparing what he's saying carefully. But anti-Semitism by Jewish writers is completely normal through the late 30s. And I'm not talking people who are in the government. I'm talking perfectly normal newspaper essays, you know, common books, common discussions. Jews up to the Holocaust, perfectly articulate, educated public Jews will be saying, well, of course Jews are a problem. Jews are this way, Jews are that way. So it's interesting that, you know, perhaps the density of what Stevens is saying is not as dumb as it seems. And as I say, sometimes there is that. I think one of the things that sometimes throws, I know you pointed out this is dumb, but still, you know, I've brought it up before in our LGBTQ groups. Older LGBTQ people like me and younger LGBTQ people who aren't speaking the same language. And when you say, well, why don't the older ones just sort of get it? There is, I realize you're not saying anything that simple, but there is also this sort of color and use of words and use of ideas and the way those are threaded into what we are. And even one of the things that my students also do when they're like defining additional letters to put onto LGBTQ, et cetera, is I'm thinking, but you do realize that as you do this across time, because it's not merely that we're of a different generation, we're also overlapping temporal memory and temporal change. When you do these things across time, you probably won't have a simple point of view on what your sexuality is. You really probably won't. Maybe at the big simple levels, but you know, one of my postgrads is like asexual now, right? I wonder if he always will be. He wants to define that now. It's terribly important. It's part of the current trend to add a letter, add a name to say, this is my sexuality, to defend it. But I'm like, yeah, well, maybe. But as psychoanalysts, people go through many selves. So I don't know. You can see I'm being a bit more Deleuzian, a bit more, but I think these questions are always present.
Thank you, Paul, for this comment. George, do you want to comment? Or?
I mean, the main thing, I'm just being cheeky here, but the main thing I want to say, I think, Paul, I think you're rolling your eyes. But I think...
not at you.
No.
Just generally.
Of course not. Of course not. I don't know. I'm not sure what you mean about the Stevens thing, because my main issue is not so much about... I mean, my issue is, if you are recognizing that this was a very, very anti-Semitic context, the problem is not so much that anti-Semitism was everywhere. That's not my problem.
Yeah.
My issue is that, you know, if you're recognizing this, then why not be more empathic with Freud, who was being paranoid? That was my main point, really.
Okay. Oh, okay. All right. I guess I was looking in the other direction at the other quote as a, oh, look, we know that Jews would be upset if anyone expresses anything anti-Semitic, where at the time, some of them wouldn't have been. A lot of them wouldn't have been, which is a very strange thing to us now, where we are more consistent about what we say, what we believe, and what we do socially, which to some extent is a product of the late 20th century. That kind of consistency is that really comes out of second wave feminism. Before that, people just didn't think that way so much. That's all.
Okay, yeah. Okay, I'm just aware there's other people who want to speak and I want to hear. I mean, Anne?
Thank you, George. That was wonderful and fun. And I loved Sarah's comment that she got confused and stupid at times. And so the growing edge that you brought us all to. So thank you for that. But I'm curious what your thoughts might be when you think about clinical application of Animix. That we think of the traditional contrasexual, that for a cisgendered woman who has a dream about a seemingly male figure, oh, that's Animus. And I'm curious help me think about Animix and how to expand all of that in applying it clinically.
I'm just going to jot things down and then I'm going to come back at things in the end. So thank you. Alan?
Oh, my question is actually like similar to Anne's question. Like when you defined, sorry, in English is not my primary language, but when you defined Animx, there was like a sense of belonging. You said it in a more technical sense, that it was like an archetypal image and not an archetype itself. But as you were talking about it, I kind of get the feeling that maybe the broader sense of this archetypal image, where it's rest in a way, was maybe that sense of belonging, and like the archetypal counterpart might be that idea of even of like the Rex idea of individuation itself, that everything has a place and everything belongs. And maybe because it's not that near it seems for me at least that it was not that near the concept of anima and animus. And I was just thinking how near this concept is, and just to define a little bit. That's kind of my question.
Thank you.
Sorry. Chema, I hope I spell it right. I would invite.
Yes, that's perfect. Thank you. Let me turn on my camera. Thanks for the presentation, George. I really enjoyed it. I wanted to comment sort of in response to what Paul was saying, that I feel like as a younger queer person, when relating to older queer people, sometimes I find that whereas we as a generation may have a difficult time considering that we might shift across our lifespan and maybe disidentify, moving to another place, I think that sometimes also older G people specifically, not like especially like all the other letters, may have a difficult time considering that another paradigm might shed some light into some of our less known aspects. And that's something that I take away from this talk, like that there is something that we could call the shadow or the unconscious, like all of these blind spots that we have, and how easy it is to forget how influenced we are by a context, both temporary and also geographic, in which we grow up. So I don't know, I'm not trying to be like conflictive or whatever, but I just wanted to acknowledge that I think that sometimes it's difficult to like acknowledge the other paradigm or the other context in which a person was brought up and how they've come to understand themselves, and also being queer. But I think there's a lot of potential in that, just like considering that it may not be like, sorry, English is also not my primary language, that it's not like just a whim or like people trying to be like obnoxious or like, I'm not sure if I'm transmitting the idea correctly, but that it can reveal something like a new discovery about what it is to like relate to yourself with a capital S, right? And to your identity and to your community. So I wanted to comment that. Thanks for the space.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Gemma, would anyone else like to comment something, question? Please feel free. Now is the moment.
Hi. Yeah, I missed the beginning, so I hope you maybe covered it at the beginning. I'm sorry, but I really enjoyed the talk. But you were talking about etiology, and I wondered what about teleology, like the purpose. For me, I find in Jungian psychology, analysts are quite often looking for what's the teleology of this of whatever it is that you're coming to analysis with. How would that come into this conversation?
Shall I come back to a couple of these points, maybe?
Yes, I think it would be good, to be more interactive.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I was a bit afraid that people would ask, how do we apply this clinically, and tell us more what you mean by Animx, because really I'm developing this, and I don't, and the answer is I don't know. I mean, I suppose one of the ways in which I apply this clinically is that I'm much more keen to just kind of not rush to try and have like a concrete understanding when it comes to issues of gender and sexuality, but also other issues as well. I think there's when I say that this trans sort of question has the potential to revitalize, this, what we do and, how we think about analysis, is that I think it forces us to actually stop stop creating these theories that are so prescriptive and so specific and so kind of knowing, really. So I have obviously I work with people where they might be wondering what to do, transition or not, or am I non-binary, am I this, am I that, and essentially I'm doing the simple thing of just trying to stick with not pretending that I know where these things come from or where they're going. And actually that connects to the etiology, teleology thing. It wasn't in the beginning, it was like actually a little bit later that I was talking about etiology and teleology. And I think I was just saying that both of these things can be potentially useful. And I think teleology is I find it much more refreshing. It's one of the reasons that attracted me to the Jungian sort of field. But I think I'm kind of proposing something else that is much more about having a sense of awe, because teleology can also be about trying to understand something, trying to really pinpoint what it is about. And that's why I think that's where I think that Jung's sort of radical not knowing sometimes in some places in his writings is really, really useful. And I also want to say something about the belonging thing, which I think is very interesting. You're right, I can't remember the name of the person who sort of made this point. You're right that it's not close to Anima and Animus. It's just it's mainly a play with the words, really, at least for the time being, But I think you are, yeah, there is something about belonging and not belonging, which is very important. And I think there's something very kind of strange about this. I mean, the grouping that we've started, for example, of queer Jungians, I mean, I feel really sorry for you who are heterosexuals or cisgender that you're not part of it. I really do. It's obviously this kind of experience of trauma that that this particular kind of trauma that we've experienced means that these if we want to say that this Animx is a thing that exists, you know, actually brings us very close together. And I feel immensely privileged to be part of it. And I am part of something. I belong there. I fit in. So it's this kind of paradox about this Animx or whatever you want to call it that makes you not belong. And there is definitely envy in people who are not queer about this. There's no doubt about that. And I think there's a lot of, I mean, I don't know whether anybody else talks about this, but I call it oppression envy. There's a lot of that going around at the moment where, you know, white people are envious of people of color because they don't belong to these kind of communities that are, you know, at the forefront of social change right now and all of that. So there's something very kind of strange going on, I think, in terms of all of that, where oppression is also envied by those who are not oppressed. That's, I don't know whether that sort of, yeah, I don't know whether that answers questions, but yeah, that's my thinking about this.
Thank you, George. It gives us a lot of things to think about, and also about your honesty, you know, that it's something which is still in development. Would anyone else like to? Someone raised. Alexander, please.
Thank you so much, George, for these wonderful presentations. Presentation about clinical approach. For example, I know there's a researcher, Susan McKenzie. She tried to use this queer reading for analysis dreams, queer people and LGBT people. And also, for example, in my research, I try to use these concepts for working with LGBTQI immigrants, especially with dreams and fairy tales. So for me, I try to find how we can connect this theoretical approach to community work and activism. And I think it's just really, very important job. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexander. Alan, Morgana?
I would like to just make another small comment. There is a passage that I really, really like. It's in 14/2, the second part, to 280. And that part, he's talking about like anima secundus, anima animus, that kind of stuff. And he points to some graphs that he draws. And then he says, which I think is like the best way to recognize it, like the question of anima and animus. And he says that it lacks the idea of transformation. So he develops the theory of animus and animus in alchemical studies, but he says that the thing missing is the stone, yeah, the philosopher's stone. So and I find it quite beautiful because it's just after he was like talking about structural things about animus and animus, and then there is this little paragraph, you know. And I would like to know if you have read it or because sometimes you read it but you forgot. But it's an interesting passage to think that the philosopher's stone, that change, is what lacks in that structural of animus and anima.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I don't remember this. Could you say again where it's from?
Oh, it's from Mysterious Conjunctus, the 14/2. I don't know how to say it in English. And the paragraph is 280.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll have a look.
After some drawings.
Interesting. Thank you for pointing this out. Mark,
Yes,
yeah.
that was half accidental, but because it's happened, I better speak. I was just in response to practical application. I mean, that's a big sort of topic, right? I'm trying to see if my brain works. I guess a foundational thing would be like, is there a belief that the psyche is working teleologically or towards wholeness or not, right? And that would be a bias in Jungian psychology that is happening. And if you believe that to be the case, then how does that appear? What is other in psyche? What needs to be connected to and quote unquote integrated to a degree? And so then you're looking out for figures, right, that want to connect with ego. And so then personal identity comes into play, because, you know, what gender does the ego identify with? What is it personal views of masculine and feminine, and what complements or contradicts or compensates that? And just on a basic note, I guess I would say there's a male figure. Does it mean it's representing something masculine? Not necessarily. You know, is it representing, you know, what is, you got to ask for a qualitative evaluation, the person, individual in question, what qualities they ascribe to it. And then also, what would I add to that, to be brief? You know, archetype per se being different, or the archetype as such being different to the archetypal image that's being represented, and that perhaps different genders can mediate archetypally something feminine, quote unquote, but not be actually female presented. You know, it just opens up that image can be shift and change, and it is entirely open to anything being representative of anything. Once you try and get the quality or description of it, then you get closer to what it might be mediating. What is the image mediating? You don't assume because it's a man in a woman's, in a cisgender woman's dream, that it's logos, that it's masculine. It may be, it may not be. I mean, that's, yeah, as brief as I can be.
Thank you for this comment.
I mean, I agree 100%, as you know, Mark. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else brave enough to share, comment, maybe a thought? Maybe one question from my side, George. How much would you connect, you know, the depth of analysis, and somehow, you know, with analysis, the psyche gets deconstructed, and there probably certain fluidity comes into play. Could you agree to this idea?
Sorry, can you say that again? I didn't.
If the gender is somehow culturally constructed, that in analysis a certain solutio happens, you know, a deconstruction happens, and then certainly certain fluidity comes into play due to analysis.
Thank you. I think if I understand the question right, I think that's a really useful point. I'm also aware Claudette has raised her hand, but just very quickly to respond to this, that I agree, you know, and I think it's really helpful as analysts to have this view in mind. I think where it becomes a bit problematic is if we demand that of people, actually. And I think I see that in clinical papers that talk about trans people often. You know, in a way, in some quarters, being non-binary is more accepted than being trans but binary. And the reason is exactly what you said just now, which I agree with you in principle, of course, but I think, you know, then there is this kind of charge of a lack of individuation, a lack of, you know, fluidity, you know, towards somebody who is a trans man or a trans woman, a binary trans person, for example. And I think that's really, you know, I think the problem is that who decides that when fluidity should come in to somebody's psyche, in other words, you know? And I think that's the sort of problem. Of course, there's other quarters where to be non-binary is more problematic because, you know, make up your mind and all of that. But I think that there are two distinct sort of kinds of transphobia within the field, I would say. and one is using what you know, I'm not saying you are right now, but I think one of the camps of transphobia, I think, uses this idea that, well, you know, what about a trans woman needs to incorporate her masculinity? Well, yes, but you don't get to decide when and how and if, actually. Because we are, you know, in a Jungian analysis, we're thinking about wholeness. That doesn't mean that anybody ever completely becomes whole. It might be that a particular person doesn't integrate some particular sort of areas, really, you know, and I think it's a sign of transphobia when some sort of people use this to kind of pathologize, really, trans people. But thank you for bringing it up, because I think I agree with you. I absolutely agree with you, but I think it can be used in a really problematic way in some quarters.
Of course, thank you for the answer. Claudette?
I'm very keen to hear Claudette.
Hi, thanks. Thanks, George. I enjoyed your talk. I can't say I agree with you entirely, but in many ways I do. For me, it's about going back to basics, because I have an issue with the whole concept of masculine and feminine. Yeah, I agree with you that Jung certainly took a big first step in identifying, unfortunately calling it contrasexual, but identifying the fact that men and women repress a lot of stuff because society doesn't accept it for the gender they appear to be. So I don't have a great need to call it anything, because to me that just buys into, you know, Jung was sort of obsessed with opposites. And there are places where opposites work and there are places where it doesn't work. And I think when it comes to human beings, following Aristotle, I would say you can't say human beings are opposites. They're just not. So to me, what Jungians need to do is to really question this whole concept, the concepts of masculine and feminine, that we need to say, really, these are social constructs. You know, maybe there's some biology underneath some of it, but we don't know, because it is all sort of mixed together. Peter Mudd once said, like ages ago, he said, it's going to take us 100 years. We'd have to stop doing all this cultural stuff and wait 100 years to see if there is such a thing. Of course, that's not going to happen. But I think basically there is not such a thing. And that the use of those words, I think, is very problematic, and we should stop using them. If we want to, you know, I mean, I realize the language issue is very difficult. Even talking about men and women, you can sort of deconstruct all that too, but at least get rid of masculine and feminine and stop labeling things. You know, as Lynn Cohen had said, why do we genderize everything? Why do we do it? It's time to stop doing it. Anyway, so I just wondered what you think about that.
Thank you. I mean, I absolutely agree with you. And I suppose that's also a bit of an answer to the question about how I use all of this clinically. The thing that I do with patients sometimes, and I know it's a bit clunky and I know it's a bit long, but when I feel that it's relevant, I might say that quality X, you feel this, that, or the other, because it's traditionally associated with masculinity or traditionally associated with femininity. And I know it's long, but I think it's the most honest way. And I do this obviously with both queer and you know, heterosexual cis sort of clients, because I want to remind them, I suppose, that I don't think that trait X belongs, you know, supposedly to their body or doesn't belong to their body, or that I know, or that, you know, but I think it is important, obviously, to acknowledge that societally that has been the case, and that has an implication on people's feelings, actually. You know, people feel, I mean, I have to say, particularly men feel particularly anxious about performing anything other than pure masculinity often. I know that's changing, but, you know, so with them especially, I would say, you know, oh, this trait that traditionally is associated with femininity, and that's why it feels painful to identify it in yourself, something like that. So I mean, absolutely, I agree with you. Thank you. Mark, did you raise your hand?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, sorry. Just just to add, I mean, something that fleeted across my mind is sort of I guess the idea of ego strength and the history of that in the classical model, and the idea of, creating opposites through identifying with something in particular to begin with, to then be complemented by, and just kind of having to undo that a bit, really. I don't think that's radical for me to say. It's just coming through my mind that, there would be the classical model saying ego strength is equated with, biological sex and gender identity being similar. Anything variant to that is ego weakness. And just there's something about being able to open up to a bit like Claudette is saying, that there still be cohesion of personality without opposites per se. It doesn't mean that somebody can't identify with opposites if they wish to, but that, ego coherence, ego strength is not equated with, separate oppositional identities or qualities necessarily. I don't know. It's just an idea. Yeah.
Thank you. That was very helpful.
Okay, maybe last round. Someone wants to ask something? Now is the time.
I'm just aware that there's been a lot of things put in chat, but yeah, I personally, I think that perhaps we should have said this in the beginning. So I would prefer people to speak, because it's exhausting reading out other people's comments. But it seems like there's been some interesting stuff in the chat as well. Just want to acknowledge that.
Okay. In this case, I would thank you, George, for this wonderful presentation and talk, and I would thank all the participants to take their time, and hopefully we see us again on some other talk and some other occasion.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you all for coming on what is a Friday evening, at least for me here. Yeah, thank you very much.
Bye.